So moving on to the presentations and the rest of the session. Next up, we have a presentation on the Alliance's most recent and our third roundtable of 2021, and that's improving regulatory pathways, which will share some insights and knowledge on both the creation of the roundtable and their outcomes. I was fortunate enough to be able to attend this roundtable alongside some representatives from the Alliance membership organisations, industrial sponsors and content experts. And I can say it's really thoughtful and inspiring conversation. So yeah, thank you for running that, for being there. So please welcome Wendy, Selig and Tammy Moore.
Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be with you virtually and by recording today. I'm Wendy Selig with WS Collaborative. I think I know many of you, and I've had the privilege of working with Kathy and the team at the Alliance on several of your roundtables. And I'm here today to give you a little bit of the background, design, and context of our most recent roundtable, Improving Regulatory Pathways. So I'm going to start by telling you about how we designed the roundtable. So the meeting participants included a broad range of stakeholders across the globe representing ALS MND organizations, representatives from this Alliance board, councils and your committees. We had officials from various industry companies. We had several invited guest speakers I'm going to tell you about. And we did invite global regulators from multiple countries to come and join us. However, they were unable to attend. And the sponsors for this meeting included these 4 companies: Amylyx, Biogen, Ionis, and Orphazyme. The meeting took place on October 5th. It took place virtually. And we had an opportunity to gather in plenary and in small groups to develop principles for a proposed global regulatory review framework that could form the basis of future advocacy by the Alliance as a whole and by individual members in their individual countries and geographies. The reason for this, I think, is probably self-evident to all of you, but clearly a very timely discussion about the need to accelerate the process of regulatory review and help to remove obstacles and barriers for promising new therapies for people living with ALS MND. We provided a series of background documents for all of our participants in advance of the meeting, helping them to all start the meeting at the same place, understanding what happens in other disease states, in various countries, and in certain national regulatory systems. We use these examples as a foundation for our members of the Alliance to think about what would be an appropriate global approach. We asked people to think about what could be both aspirational and also feasible to achieve. And as I mentioned, we had an opening plenary session, and then we had 2 group discussions at various times of the day to accommodate as many time zones as possible. So at the meeting, Tammy Moore, who you'll hear from in a little bit, set the stage for us from a perspective of why now? Why should the Alliance take on this opportunity now? Why is this responsibility important? Why do we need an alternative and more harmonized global approach? We also heard very compellingly from Norm McIsaac. He set out a call to action about what it is like to be a person living with ALS MND, and what he described, my favorite term, the dog's breakfast of current approaches to regulatory review around the world. And then Kalani Balas, the CEO of the ALS Association in the United States, provided an overview of the process and status of development of regulatory guidance for ALS review in the US by the Food and Drug Administration. We had expert presentations. I was very happy that my friend Jeff Allen, the CEO of an organization in the US called Friends of Cancer Research, he was there to provide an overview of the approach that Friends takes to improve and accelerate regulatory processes for oncology products in the US, including how they have developed a strong and informal partnership with leaders at the FDA. Jeff also talked about Project Orbis, which is an example of harmonized regulatory review that was developed by the US FDA and now involves cancer review divisions of agencies around the world in a number of countries. We also heard from Dave Zook from Faegre Drinker. Dave talked about the recent example with an Alzheimer's drug called Aduhelm and the situation involving clinical development and regulatory review of that product in the US, which has been the subject of much discussion and some controversy recently. And then we heard from Dr. Jinsey Andrews from Columbia University. She talked about the Amylyx example in ALS, which is something I think this group is extremely familiar with. She talked about the history and clinical development timeline for a drug to treat people living with ALS by Amylyx. She talked about the milestone publication in 2020 of results from recent clinical studies. And she also talked more generally about the different pathways for regulatory review that take place in the US and also around the globe. We then broke into two groups. Each group had the same assignment, which was to work through the draft principles that were created and provided in advance for a global regulatory harmonization framework. We asked for members of these small groups to provide input and suggestions for how to revise or what to add to these principles. In the two groups, we had some very important key takeaways. Firstly, the need to be aspirational, or the desire to be aspirational, but also to be realistic. We talked a lot about how various countries and geographies around the globe are at different states of readiness in terms of their regulatory systems and how quickly or easily they might be able to adopt this proposed framework. So we need to aspire to something that would make sense for people living with ALS MND, but we also need to be realistic in terms of expectations for how quickly these types of frameworks could be adopted. We stress the importance of framing the needs of people living with ALS MND and their community first and foremost. And we also emphasize the importance of engaging multi-stakeholders, including industry partners, to operationalize such a framework. It's one thing to have a set of principles about a regulatory process, but if the sponsors, the companies that are developing these products aren't able or aren't willing to live within that framework, then that's a problem. I'd like to now turn it over to Tammy Moore to give you more details about where we ended up.
Thank you, Wendy, for that very thoughtful review of how we got to where we are today. What I now want to share with you are the outcomes that came from the result of that work. And as I shared in the very first meeting that we had about this, it was really, I think, a naivete on behalf of many of us that thought that as soon as we were through clinical trials, that we would have access to therapies for our community. And we now know all too well that that is not the reality. And so we need to move forward collectively to be able to advance this work. So the next steps, and we'll get into this in a moment, but really will be the feedback from the conversations and the next steps relating to how we were going to work through this as an alliance and then as individual organizations. But as we move to that, there are a few things that I just want to cover off that were thought about as we were generating the articles that we need to consider. So the first was that we actually looked at the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and Optional Protocol. This kind of gave us a grounding for what we needed to be thinking about for living conditions of persons with disabilities in every country, particularly in developing countries. We also took a look at the fundamental rights of people living with ALS MND and the work that was done at the Alliance to complete this. Again, emphasizing that each person has the right to the highest quality of treatment available within their healthcare system, an important nuance as we're a global organization. And we recognize that these principles represent the ideal for individuals living with ALS MND worldwide, understanding that they may not be available in all geographies at this time, but it is something that we can aspire to collectively. We also are concerned that many organizations, regulators, do not understand the urgency of ALS MND. And I think even within Canada, we can see that as the most recent therapy was only granted a regular review, which would be 300 days, versus a priority review, which would be 180 days. And from the work that we do within our community, we know all too well that this length of time is so significant. We also understand that regulators want to remain fully independent in being able to make their decisions and that they have to adhere to internal timelines, but that doesn't stop them or preclude them from sharing accountability and risk. And we recognize that the medical produce sponsors or the pharmaceutical companies are expected to meet specific criteria for regulatory review in each country. We took a look at Project Orbis, and Wendy had referenced this earlier, which was an initiative that was specific to the oncology space. And I think that there are some good things to be able to consider this. We also are convinced that a comprehensive international convention to promote this harmonization of regulatory approval will help to uphold the rights of those individuals with ALS MND to have equal access to new treatments and clinical trials in both the developing and developed countries. And we recognize that this convention represents a proposed framework for all Alliance membership organizations, and that we should collectively adopt and promote it. So now let's just transition into the purpose and the articles that we really want to see. So the first is that the Alliance is seeking to encourage all regulatory agencies to develop a global framework for alignment in evaluating potential new therapies for people living with ALS MND. We believe that the ALS MND community and all stakeholders will benefit from a more cooperative global approach to the evaluation of risks and the benefit of novel therapies, especially given the global nature of drug development and clinical trial conduct. And of course, people living with ALS MND, regardless of where they reside, have extraordinary unmet need and seek the fastest and widest possible access to potentially beneficial therapies. Given the devastating nature of ALS MND, this community cannot wait for excessive procedural delays caused by sequential reviews and handoffs. We also understand that pivotal clinical trials in ALS MND are often conducted internationally, and that these global trials are increasingly important for investigating the safety and effectiveness of ALS MND drugs for approval. Future drug development may benefit by establishing a greater uniformity of new global standards of treatment, leading to the optimal design of these important trials. There should be a cooperative, harmonized pathway to approval. So there's a few basic tenets within our articles. The first principle is that the perspectives of benefits and risks, expertise and experiences of people living with ALS MND and their caregivers and healthcare providers should be at the core of clinical development and global regulatory review discussions. Principle 2 is that regulators from each country and region align on a regulatory review with the purpose to drive outcomes. And principle 3 is that regulators develop harmonized guidance and process pathways, encouraging sponsors to submit engagement before applications for ALS MND products to participating countries for concurrent review. And of course, we want to see that the regulators are working together. And so we would like to understand the regular interaction that they're using to share information and to participate in mutual engagement that leads to a more harmonized approval process. And principle 5 is that objective measures of progress are developed by the stakeholder community in conjunction with regulators and used in reporting. We all want to understand what's being undertaken. The third article is around obligations. We would like to see that the global regulatory ALS MND lead within each regulatory authority, that we want somebody within each of the authorities to have a responsibility. The seventh principle is that there is one global regulator that's identified as the lead convener for this effort. This could even be on a rotating responsibility so that in a series of countries, they all take a turn. Principle 8 is that regulators will have transparency with all stakeholders in the ALS MND community so that we understand what progress is being made. That's for both people who are living with ALS, their caregivers, organizations like ours, provide care, research and advocacy, academics, researchers and scientists, and of course, the representatives of the product sponsor entities. We understand there will be disclosure sensitivities, but we still want to see transparency where at all possible. So what's next? Well, the next steps mean that the Alliance is going to be working together to be able to move this work forward. And then how can we do this work within each of our own countries to make sure that we're able to advance this proposal? I look forward to the upcoming discussion and to your questions so that we can, again, continue to progress this work. I would also like to thank again Wendy Selig for her contribution, for all the participants who were engaged in this roundtable, and for all of the people who have helped us make this work possible.
Thank you so much, Wendy and Tammy. That was great. Time for some question and answers now. I'm just looking at the chat. Let's see if we've got any questions there. I don't think we do yet. So I'm going to come in straight away with the opportunity to ask you something. It was noted that regulators were not at the table. So I was just wondering, how will the group be working to get them there in the future?
Excellent. Good morning, Nick, and thank you very much for moderating this session. Really appreciate it. We had invited the regulators within Canada, and I know in other countries they had been invited. And it was unfortunate that they weren't able to be there, but I think as we continue this work forward, it's going to be a very important aspect of being able to progress it. Because just as we recognize that not having the manufacturers at the table or creating something that they can't live within, it's also, we can create whatever we want, but if we can't get the regulators to buy in, there's going to be an issue with it. So I know as we continue to further engage with Health Canada even, we've seen a change and a shift in how they're working with us. They're now creating patient listening sessions, for instance, even as we see AMX 0035 being going through the regulatory approval process. So we're hopeful as we build those relationships that we'll be able to make some of those transitions. And I think it's going to be really important that the countries that are progressing the therapies through the approvals take that leadership to be able to have those relationships built, which can then hopefully, in a push-pull, help to bring other countries along as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, there is a question there, probably part of the same question, which is what is needed to get them all at one table for a discussion with the ALS community? So,
I think it's going to be internal pressure that's going to be a factor in it. And even as we've seen the therapies that have been moving through or the call, our communities actually have a lot to say. And I believe that pressure, and just as we want to see the patient voice involved in the decision making, I think that pressure that we've seen through social media and other ways, we know that we have a very passionate community. We know that ALS defines unmet need. And so our community and bringing that forward, these are people that vote. These are people that have something to say. They are people that have the most at stake here. So I think that will be a big factor in being able to bring the countries. And then frankly, we see that kind of measuring up from country to country, which I think will also be consideration.
Yeah, because for country to country, I mean, for countries which don't have therapies going through a regulatory review, there's a question around how they participate.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so that's one of the benefits. I think the big thing that we come from the Alliance and the fact that we are organizations globally that are working to advance this. So while there will be a couple of countries and a couple of members that may have more exposure or experience with this, I think it's when all of our organizations and our member associations help to advance it. And so by being at the table, we help to understand the nuance within countries as well. And there might be something that we can find within a country that hasn't yet seen this approval process, that maybe there's something that we can learn from that experience or from that environment, or that we can help to push within their environment if we have a better understanding as well. So I think it's that opportunity to collectively come around the table and work together on this issue.
Sounds good. Yeah, I mean, a global harmonized framework sounds really aspirational, and which is great, but also sounds really hard and really big.
Yes.
so realism, I think it was mentioned about realism. I think that is key, and to make this achievable. So yeah, exciting to see.
Where it is too is the fact that the ALS community globally, we have a certain size, we have so much commonality amongst it. And so is there a way that we can kind of bring that to the forefront? And even as we look at it with other diseases and we learn, as we did yesterday, even from the work that SMA has done, how have they helped to advance, and where can we see those similarities that we can learn from?
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, we're at 10 past, so I think that's time now. But thank you, Tammy, and thank you, Wendy, as well, for that wonderful presentation.